to About You. I'm Connie Hogan. Well, my guest today represents a bit of a departure from my usual, more casual chats and conversations with my friends and colleagues around Bloomfield and Birmingham. Virginia Haratunian is the author of Orphan in the Sands, an autobiographical novel that depicts the 1915 Armenian genocide at the hands of Ottoman Turks. In her book, Virginia gives a first-hand account, along with her mother, of the atrocities of this war and their amazing journey to Ellis Island in New York and to America. And in some ways, it kind of parallels some of the things that are going on in the world and other parts of the world, and how lucky we are to be in America. Virginia, welcome.
Thank you.
Virginia, I always start out with my guests is asking them to, give a little bit of their background, but since your book is mostly about your background, why don't you start out telling us like what you're doing now and kind of the more recent history?
Okay. Even though I was born in the United States of America and graduated from the University of Michigan Music School in 1958, my demons are from another time and place. My mother was a survivor at the age of 7 of a starvation to the Desert March at the hands of the Ottoman Turks in the 1915 Armenian genocide.
Wow.
And the Armenia existed 600 years before Christ.
Wow.
And in 301 AD, they became the first Christian nation. But in the 1160s, the barbaric Seljuk Turks invaded Armenia on horseback with sabers in their hands and knives clenched between their teeth, and they took over Armenia. Armenia was a Christian nation. They did not fight, and they were family orientated. So since that time, they became victims to the Turks.
Okay.
And the Armenians would ask for reforms. They would overtax the Armenians. They would violate young Armenian girls, and the Armenians would have to marry their girls off at 13. And they violated the Armenian teenagers, and the Armenians would ask for reforms. The Turks would agree, but they would turn around and treat the Armenians worse.
Wow.
And they said, never, never appeal to the Western countries for help.
Okay.
So 2 years before 1915, the Turks drew up a blueprint to kill every Armenian over the age of 5.
Wow.
On the eve of April 24th, they gathered 250 or more Armenian intellectuals and shot them to death.
Oh, wow.
Then they drafted Armenian men the pretext of going into the Turkish army. And then the Germans taught them deportation, which was a euphemism for mass murder. The bullets became too expensive, so the Turks put the old people, women, and children on a starvation death march to the desert.
Oh, wow.
My mother was one of them.
Wow.
She was born 50 miles south of the Black Sea. In July, she was having breakfast with her mother, brother, and baby sister. Her father had died a year earlier, and the Turkish soldiers broke into her house and forced them to line up on the dirt road, waiting for her relatives and other Armenians. My mother was 7 years old, and she thought they were going on a field trip. So they started to walk through the fields without water or food, and at night they had to sleep on the ground.
Wow.
And the next morning, when she heard bullets, she knew they were going to kill her.
Wow.
So they continued to march, and there were hundreds of people shoving and pushing, and her mother was carrying the baby sister, so she let go of my mother's hand.
Oh, wow. And that's when you said your mother last saw your
Yep,
her
my mother never found her mother again.
Oh, that's so awful.
And she was wondering why her mother did not look for her.
Right.
And her brother was waiting at the side of the road to give her breadcrumbs, and her mouth was so dry she couldn't swallow.
Oh, my
And that
God.
was the last time she saw her brother.
Brother.
And they continued to walk. She continued to walk until she was so weak she fell to the ground. And this childless Turkish man told the soldier to give her to him. He took her home.
Oh, to his home.
Yeah, he was kind, but the wife was abusive, and there was an Armenian maid there, and her son had married their daughter.
Okay.
And she told my mother in Armenian that these are your parents now.
Oh, wow. So they kind of adopted her in a
Yeah.
way. But that worked out for her, though. I mean, she was lucky, right?
Yeah.
She was
In
very
a way,
lucky.
in a way.
In a
but,
way, yes.
she didn't understand Turkish.
Oh,
So
okay.
the wife asked her for a hammer. And when there was no response, in her anger, she took the hammer and hit my mother over the head.
Oh, my goodness.
And my mother could not cry or make a sound because she would hit my mother again.
Oh, my goodness.
So she burned some rags and put the ashes over her head. And my mother could not tell the father.
Wow. That was wild. So your mother by that time was how old?
7.
7, okay. So then how did, take me through, she was with these people and they were somewhat her adoptive parents in a way. So how long did she stay with them, and then how did she make the break to get away?
So the lady treated her better for 4 months, but one day she accused her of stealing a silver belt. She never saw the silver belt, and she said, if you don't say yes, I'll beat you again.
Oh, my goodness.
So when she asked her again, my mother nodded yes. So when the father came home, she told the father, and when the father asked her, my mother nodded yes. So he was going to get some pins to prick her fingers, and there was a Turkish neighbor there, and the Turkish neighbor stopped him. So then he put her old clothes with the feces and the tears and everything back on and walked her to the police station and left her there.
Oh, at the police station.
Yeah.
And that was in the Turkish area.
Yeah, and they didn't give her any food or water. And near supper time, they told her she could go home. So when she went home, the mother told her they would have a pipe in the square to go and wash. And my mother went, and she decided to run away.
Oh, that's how she broke away.
So she looked back to see if anybody was watching, and she slowly started to walk, and then it was faster, and she started running, she said, for about 20 minutes. And then she found a hole under the porch of an abandoned house, and she hid in there until midnight. But then she was afraid if someone found her, they would kill her.
Oh, yeah.
So she went to various homes, and when they saw her, they would open the door and they would slam the door in her face until she came to this home of 2 women who had a baby. And she told them her name was Jamila. That's Turkish for star. So they took her in, and she was very happy because she stayed with the baby, and they were very good to her. They didn't beat her.
But they were Turkish women, too.
Yeah.
They're kind of part of that sect.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So she stayed with them, and they had a neighbor, Arax, who was a Protestant.
Oh, okay.
And they kind of left the Protestants alone because they were connected to America.
Right.
And they timed this during World War I, when there was more focus on World War I and neglect to the genocide.
Okay.
So Arax asked my mother, are you Armenian? And my mother said no, nodded her head no, because she didn't want the Turkish father to find her.
Oh, okay.
So the next time when these ladies sent her there for a cup of sugar, she said, if you tell me you're Armenian, I'll give you a doll. So my mother nodded yes. She didn't give her a doll, but she wrapped her body in a wrap and put a scarf over her head and gave her to this Armenian man to take her to the Near East missionaries.
Oh, okay.
Now, when I say it was an orphanage, it was a dilapidated house, and there were lice in there and everything, and my mother got lice in her head, and she stayed in this orphanage. One day, when she was outside playing with the other orphans, this Rose, this Armenian maid, spotted my mother. So she went back and told the Turkish father.
Oh, wow.
And the ladies working there told my mother, the father is going to come back and want to take you.
Back to the original
Yeah.
people.
She said, do you want to go? My mother said, no, because I don't want the wife to beat me. And they said, don't worry, you can say no.
Okay.
So when the father came, my mother ran and hid in the wine cellar. And he went downstairs looking for her, and he didn't find her. So he came back up, and he told them he'd be back next week. So when he came again, she went down and hid in the wine cellar. And he went down there, and this time he found her. He lit a match.
Oh.
And she came out from her fear. She kissed his hand. And he took her upstairs, and he said, do you want to come with me? My mother said, no, nodded her head, no. The two sisters were behind her.
Okay.
My mother said no, and so he left.
And that was it.
Then my mother was in orphanages for 10 years. They were called the Starving Armenians.
Now, whereabouts would that be, like in today's world, on the map? Where is that?
That's in ancient Armenia near Kharpet, which is like in the middle, which is called Turkey today.
Turkey today. That's what I thought. Yeah.
And this is the poster. Cleveland Dodge was the chairman of the American Near East Missionaries, and they collected $1 million to feed the starving Armenian orphans.
Wow.
And when she was in the orphanage in Mesre, she loved education. And this was her elementary diploma signed by the American Near East missionary, Isabel Harley, June 14, 1921. Now, they were transported. The missionaries would run out of money. Then they would collect money. My mother didn't know she had relatives in America.
Oh, okay.
And they took her to Idhipsu, Greece,
Okay.
dormitories. And
Okay.
the orphans
Wow.
stayed there. But there was an orphan there that wet her bed. So she fasted for 3 days. And my mother thought, maybe if I fast, I can find my relatives. So she fasted for 3 days, and they brought this Armenian orphan, and they said, is anybody here from Divrik? They said, yes, it was my mother. At that time, her name was Turvanda.
Now, she was getting older by this time.
Yeah,
right?
she was maybe 10 or 11.
Okay.
And they introduced her to Kalista. And Kalista and my mother went to the same Armenian school in the village. And Kalista told me, you have relatives in America. And another orphan standing next to her said, if you give me your pictures and your description, I'll send it to my uncle in Chicago, and he'll put it in the newspapers, and maybe you'll find your relatives. So she did that.
Wow.
Well, my mother's two uncles, Harry and Dick, came to America in 1910, before the genocide.
Before the genocide.
And Uncle Harry lived in Ohio, and this man showed him my mother's picture and letter. So my Uncle Harry wrote a letter to my mother and said, give me your description, give me the names of all your relatives, so it would verify that she was his relative.
Oh, okay.
So she did that, and he sent her $300
Oh, wow.
to
What a
come.
story. Wow.
So my mother told the house mother, and the house mother said, no, you can't go. They'll take your money and you'll be stranded out in the streets. The agents would take her money. So my mother started to cry, and she sent the money back. Well, the story goes on. My mother becomes a maid to many different families. She's in now Alexandria, Egypt.
Okay.
And she's very lonely because this Italian family would not let her eat with them. She would eat alone. So she complained to the archbishop. And the archbishop told her to throw her suitcase. This is the only
That's
this
it. Oh, my
suitcase.
goodness. Wow.
This is the only
That's wild.
suitcase
Yeah.
she came to America with.
Oh, my gosh.
And he would put her in a different place. The story goes on. My mother finally is with a Syrian family, and they had a little boy named Lulu. So all my mother had to do was take care of Lulu. And she would put him in the closet and teach him Armenian. And so the story goes on, and if the readers are interested, they can read my book to hear the
Yeah,
other.
I think now I admit I haven't read it, but I want to read it now because I'll be filling in the blanks of all that you're
Yes,
telling me. Yes.
but
Make more sense.
The
Yeah.
main message of this book is about me. I was born in America,
Okay.
and I learned through therapy with a psychiatrist that my mother's emotional scars were passed down to my brother and me.
And you were telling me earlier that you only really kind of knew this later in your life, though, correct?
Yes,
Like you were at Michigan and all that.
Yes, I taught for 30 years, and this colleague of mine brought papers from Oakland University for me to get a master's in teaching reading and writing. And Dr. Harry Hahn assigned us to write a story.
Okay.
Well, I remembered when I was 9, we had a Michigan basement, and I went down looking through the junk, and I found this suitcase.
Wow.
So I
It's in
showed,
pretty good shape.
yeah,
Isn't it?
yeah, showed it to my mother. She said, "Take it down. It's dusty and dirty," and that's the only possession I came to America with.
Oh, wow.
And I remembered that suitcase, so I ran home. I went to her closet and I found it, and all her history is in this suitcase.
Oh, my goodness. That's amazing.
Yeah, and so
It's very valuable to you.
yes, and my mother got cancer of the trachea late in life, and the doctor pulled me aside and said, "You should ask your mother what she would like to do because it may reoccur." So when I asked her, she said she wanted to go to Ellis Island. At that time, Ellis Island was dilapidated. I said, "Ellis Island, why don't we go to Florida or California?" She said, "No, I want to go to Ellis Island." So I drove her there in one day,
Oh,
and we met the librarian, Barry Marino, who is still there. He greeted us, and he took us all around Ellis Island, and my mother showed me the room. The guide asked us, "Do you know anyone going through Ellis Island?" My mother jumped up and down, raising her hand. It's the first time I saw her animated.
Ah.
And I was hoping he would call on her because there was a group.
Okay.
And he called on her, and she pointed to the 3rd floor. She said, "I stayed there for 2.5 months."
wow.
And all the people came around her, embracing her. And when we sat in the Great Hall on a bench, my mother started to tell me her story.
So this was the first time?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
So when she told me that she lost her mother,
That was so
and I never
sad.
knew that.
Wow.
And it just, I mean,
So by this time, when this was going on, you were like 50 or
Yep.
so? Wow, that's amazing.
and it hurt me so much that she lost her mother, and I never knew it.
How did how did all of you originally wind up here in Michigan?
My father's brother came here, and he put in the newspaper looking for his 2 brothers Michael and Louis Hartunian.
Okay.
And when he found the contact, they came from Niagara Falls, and my uncle was here, so my father was here. But when my mother, by the way, they put her on a boat to send her back to Egypt
Okay.
because her uncles were not citizens.
Mm.
And my father's cousin, when my mother got to Troy, New York, to her relatives, my father's cousin went to the train station and he met her, so he telegrammed my dad and said, "You're not marrying anybody but this Armenian orphan."
Oh, wow.
He had made $1,800 working in the foundry.
So back then, that was a whole lot.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, it was different, yeah.
So he took the train, and my mother knew nothing about this, and went to Troy, New York, and they introduced him to her the first time. His time was limited, 3 weeks. So the second night, her uncle said to my father's cousin, "Let's go in the kitchen, I'll show you my violin." And my father approached her about marriage.
And how old was she at that point?
How old was she? 20.
Okay, so she was, yeah, okay, yeah.
And he said, "Would you like to get married?" And my mother said, "No."
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
She said, "I never had a family. I never had relatives. And it's the first time I found my family. And I don't want to leave
Right,
them."
right, yeah.
But she knew that her uncles were poor.
Mm-hmm.
They were married and had children, and she was a burden. So he said, "Well, don't you want to start a life of your own,
Mm-hmm.
a family of your own, And he said, "I'll send you back every year to see your family."
Mm.
So he gave her time to think about it. And she cried and cried, and her uncle said to her, "Other women want to get married, and here you have the opportunity." And what really clinched it is my mother knew she was a burden.
To the
So
other, okay.
after a week, she said yes.
Oh, so she changed her mind.
Now, many, many Armenian women from survivors of the genocide were mail order brides.
Yeah. I mean,
Anytime they had the opportunity, they married men 20 years older.
Right.
They married men that they never knew or anything, but they were desperate.
Right,
And most of them were mail order brides.
right. I know in history there's a lot of time periods, and in South America, well, I mean, wherever, Cuba, I mean, there's been a lot of that over the years, especially that part of the world.
Terrible,
Awful.
terrible.
It's amazing. And I mean, we all know stories about different places, arranged marriages and so forth, kind of thing.
Now, the main message in my book, studying, I never knew this, and I would never know this, because if I didn't take therapy, I would not have learned it. But the psychiatrist said my mother had to numb her feelings in order to survive. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She was just like, and that would just antagonize me when I was growing up. And I took to the piano. When I would try to talk to her and explain my feelings and everything, it was like talking to the wall, and I would get very frustrated, and I would run and play the piano, and the tears would be streaming down my face.
Wow.
Because
You couldn't
I didn't
understand
know my
how-
mother, and I didn't like her, and I felt like she didn't like me. And when I learned this,
why she was like
I
that.
felt so guilty. So guilty. So I dedicated the 17 years of my life, and I took care of her day and night. Every night she would sit on her edge of her bed and pray. And I would go in there and I'd say, "I love you, Mom." And she would smile and say, "I love you too," and we would hug.
Oh, so you did
So we
kinda
had a
get
loving
together, yeah.
relationship.
That's awesome, though.
And I was giving a book talk at the Birmingham Community House, and my mother was there,
Oh, okay.
and my psychiatrist was there. And my mother said she felt that it was her fault that I never married. And I said, it's not your fault because you couldn't help it. But like my mother, because from the fetus to 5 years old, the psychiatrist said, it's very important how a mother hugs a child, talks to the
That's
child,
exactly right.
puts positive input, and from that, the child gets self-esteem,
Right.
positive, feels good about themselves. My brother and I did not get that. And so we tried to use food to fill that void. And like my mother, I had self-doubts. Every exam I took at the university, I thought I would fail, even if I got an A. And I had such self-doubt, such fear, such trauma that my mother had because it was passed down to me.
No wonder. I mean, this was survival. I mean, it was so, that was the number one thing with all of you guys.
So all these scars from the genocide are passed down, and really people don't know about it. It's intangible. Until you take time. It's very difficult to take a good look at yourself and find out what you can do to improve that.
Right.
And after 2 years, the psychiatrist said that I could stop, and I said, no, I'm not stopping. I'm going to go until I feel that I'm healed. He said, you will not be completely healed. It's like a house with 3 strong walls and 1 weak wall. So you're not completely healed, but I feel that I've healed a lot, and that's one of the reasons why I did not marry, because I was not comfortable with affection.
Wow. So this is all like in the book about post-traumatic stress and all of, I mean, that's really what it's about.
Yep, it's really about me.
Right. So it's an autobiographical.
My
novel.
professor said it's an annotated bibliography. My mother and me.
Okay.
That's what I did when I was writing it, to
About your mother, that's
to
what I
show
thought,
2
yeah.
women and how we became really one because of the genocide.
Now, your mother lived to be older, you said, though.
90.
90. So when did she, so she died a while ago, though.
2000.
Oh, so 20 years ago, okay. But in the end, you felt like that you did kind of close the gap, and now how did you reconnect with your brother? Because you said you didn't see him after you parted with your
No,
brother.
my mother didn't see her brother
Oh,
on the
okay.
march.
Okay, on the march. Okay.
And she never knew what happened to them. And on the boat coming into New York Harbor, she kind of felt guilty that she survived and they did not.
Wow, that's amazing. So, so now you remind me, were you actually born here?
Yes.
Or, okay, in
Pontiac,
Michigan.
Michigan.
Oh, Pontiac. Okay, well, I got that wrong.
I
in my
taught in
head.
Pontiac.
Okay, that's where you taught.
I
okay.
taught at Belleville High School and Washington Junior in Pontiac.
Okay. Okay, well, I get the notice that we're almost running out of time, but this has been so fascinating. Now, is there anything else, like in summary, you would like to tell the audience about? I mean, I think we've covered so much of the, the trauma and the amazing life that you've had
Well, I'd like to say
by the book.
the Armenians who survived, they loved America. They made great
That's awesome.
contributions to
Right.
America.
I know a lot of, I think I told you, I know a lot of business people who are Armenian descent, and
There's Dr. Damadian, who just died several weeks ago. He invented the MRI. William Soroyan, a great writer. Governor Duke Mekchin, who was the governor of New York.
Okay.
And even here in Detroit, Alex
Okay.
Manoogian.
okay, so we're going to have to wrap it up, but thank you so much for coming, Virginia, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you very much.